Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Serena. I'm from the Public Policy Institute of Our Hong Kong Foundation and your MC today. Thank you for joining today's exclusive live webinar on the outlook of Hong Kong as an international financial center. Today, we're honored and delighted to have here with us Mr. Joseph Yam. Mr. Yam was the chief executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority from its establishment in 1993 to 2009, and it's currently a non-official member of the Executive Council of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And now, without further ado, may I invite Mr. Yam to share with us his thoughts. Mr. Yam, please.
Thank you very much. And good day to you all, wherever you are, and keep well. Wear a mask, as I'm doing now, and help yourself and others to stay healthy, to fight the virus. Now, I've been asked to speak about the outlook of Hong Kong as an international financial center, and I would like actually to start with a rather fundamental point. You may think that this is rather too basic for you, but please bear with me. In the financial world, there are two types of people. One with money to spare, the investors, including depositors, and the other wanting to borrow money, wanting to raise money, the fundraisers. Now, if it is possible to mobilize money from those who have it to those in need of it, then the economy prospers. Now, unfortunately, the risk appetite of the investors and the risk profiles of the fundraisers differ. And there is a mismatch. And therefore, you need somebody in between, which is the financial system, to mobilize that money on behalf of these people. And in mobilizing it, they have to do what I call the 3 T's of financial intermediation: transforming risk, transferring risk, and transacting risk. Now, the banks obviously transform risk from the ability of the borrower to repay money into the risk of the bank in repaying depositors. That's a transformation of risk. And when a financial institution organizes, let's say, a debt issue by a borrower, the financial institution therefore transfers the risk from the borrower to the investor. And the transaction of risk, which is very important, is to provide liquidity, like the stock market. You have buy and sell a particular stock so that in the primary market, money can be mobilized from investors into those who are raising money through IPOs. Now, that's the role of the financial system, a very fundamental role. If you are doing that on an international dimension, which is necessary because you would want investors to be able to diversify their investment opportunities, and for fundraisers to diversify their funding sources on an international dimension, and therefore internationalizing financial intermediation is very important. It's very efficient, actually, for a particular economy. So if you're doing that on an international basis, that's international financial activity. That's what we are specializing in in Hong Kong. And if you're talking about the international dimension of finance, you are realistically talking about the mainland of China and the rest of the world, all right? So this is what we as an international financial center should focus on. Now, unfortunately, there are so many rankings and labels out there in the market trying to promote financial business instead of focusing on the need for finance to support the economy. But we, as Hong Kong as an international financial center, should really stay focused. Now, I believe that the SAR government, the Hong Kong SAR government, has a policy stance that has this sort of focus. On the monetary side, for example, we have a fixed exchange rate. The US dollar is the international currency, is the medium of transaction internationally. To carry out international financial transactions, most of them use the US dollar. And if the Hong Kong dollar is linked to the US dollar very firmly, using a very robust monetary system, Hong Kong dollar is as good as the US dollar, then international investors and fundraisers would feel at ease to operate in Hong Kong, isn't it? So monetary policy, we've got the right monetary policy. On the financial side, there is what I call a light touch policy, giving the market to take the initiative to do what they think should be done, all right? But with a very strong focus, as I mentioned earlier, on the need for finance to be supporting the economy. Now, when I was at the HKMA, I was responsible also for banking supervision. I often just ask the bank, go ahead and do whatever you think is bearing in mind this particular focus of financial intermediation in support of the economy. And sometimes they come back to the supervisors and ask rather silly questions, actually. Hey, should we be doing this or should we be doing that? But I would tell them that that's their business, all right? But on one occasion, I can tell you, there was a bank coming to me and say, there is these subprime mortgages that we would like to promote in Hong Kong. Should we be doing that? So I said, how is that going to help borrowers and fundraisers? And I asked the question, if it is subprime, why lend? So he went away quickly. Oh, another thing is that banks sometimes, or financial institutions sometimes, want to play the market. You know how these financial markets are? Many of them are actually zero-sum games, okay? And many people want to play in this zero-sum game, expecting to win day after day, quarter after quarter, year after year. How can you do that? Because if you win, others would lose. Now, this sort of activity, I really did not encourage. Because if you are going to win in a zero-sum game year after year, you must, first of all, be very lucky. I don't really want financial institutions to be operating on the basis of luck. You may have inside information, but that's really illegal, isn't it? And you can have sophisticated models to do all sorts of high-frequency trading in order to benefit, in order to gain money. But in this financial world, if you have a sophisticated model, it can be replicated by others in no time. That's why I discourage, this sort of what I call frills in the financial system. Be focused. Focus on what you are supposed to do. Now, the external environment that Hong Kong faces actually is quite beneficial to Hong Kong in our development as an international financial center. As I said, we are focusing on financial intermediation between the mainland of China and the rest of the world. The mainland of China It's the second largest economy in the world with a very high savings rate and a balance of payment surplus, and therefore is an exporter of capital. On the other hand, the rest of the world, well, not knowing China that much hitherto, and if you look at the investment funds of this world, they are hugely underweight in investment in the second largest economy in the world. So there are investors, there are fundraisers wishing actually to do business between themselves, between the mainland of China and the rest of the world. And Hong Kong is the place for them to congregate and do this sort of business. At the same time, obviously, the mainland of China is opening up. It's being rather cautious, rightly cautious about embracing financial globalization, and therefore the mainland of China needs an offshore market to conduct financial intermediation on that international dimension. So Hong Kong is the ideal place for doing just that. And as a result of successfully doing this over the years, you have these various channels of financial intermediation which have actually developed extremely well. Now, I don't know whether you know this, the banking sector of Hong Kong, in terms of its total assets, is almost 9 times of our GDP. For an economy of 7.5 million people, you don't really need that big of banking system. That's an indication of how international we are. We are serving the mainland of China. We're serving the rest of the world. We have been very, very successful in doing that. If you look also at the balance sheet of the banking system, almost 50% are external assets, and around the same sort of number are external liabilities. So we are very, very international. Now, on the equity market, I don't really have to mention. Such a small economy, and we put through the money from investors to IPO fundraisers, which is the largest in the world in absolute terms, not in relation to our GDP, but in absolute terms. We have been very, very successful. Relatively less successful is the debt market, but that's partly because we haven't actually been borrowing much money in Hong Kong. But we do have a very smooth benchmark yield curve as reference for whoever that wants to be raising debt in Hong Kong and in Hong Kong dollar. And now, obviously, we also have the renminbi debt market being developed in Hong Kong. So we have been very successful, okay, as an international financial center, focusing on doing things that support the economy. Of course, other than these 3 traditional channels of financial intermediation, we have other international financial activities, fund management, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't spend too much time on that. Now, to what we are facing. We have, in the past year or so, faced a number of shocks, the first one being social unrest. Now, I wouldn't want to go into detail about the cause of this social unrest. I think there are deep-rooted problems in Hong Kong in terms of the disparity of income and wealth in Hong Kong, in terms of the housing problem, which our Hong Kong Foundation has been doing quite a lot of works on those subjects. And unfortunately, on this social unrest, I think there are external forces involved. Spreading malicious rumors about our financial system, about our monetary system, et cetera, et cetera. But fortunately, so far so good. All those malicious rumors have not actually affected Hong Kong. Our international financial center status is intact as a result of the social unrest. But one very important point is that social unrest is actually affecting the safety of people in Hong Kong. Now, people in the financial system, financial talents, are very mobile. And if their personal safety has been affected, they may just go. So if this sort of thing, this social unrest is not contained effectively, there is a danger that our status as an international financial center will be affected. Fortunately, of course, we have the national security law, which I think will form a basis, form the foundation of social order and safety returning to Hong Kong. That's the first shock. It may still be ongoing, but I think we have that foundation for returning social order to Hong Kong. Now, the second shock that we have experienced is obviously COVID-19. Now, again, I don't think this has a lot of impact on Hong Kong as an international financial center. COVID-19 has brought a sharp economic shock to Hong Kong. And that shock to Hong Kong, economic shock to Hong Kong, has got to be handled. And the government is coming up with responses at the policy level. At the monetary level, fortunately, the US is implementing rather loose monetary policy, easy money. And that actually is appropriate for Hong Kong. And through our link to the US dollar, we have imported this easy monetary policy in Hong Kong, which fits our economic needs at the present time. On the fiscal side, we're running fairly large budget deficit, amounting to this year, it could well amount to 10% of GDP or 300 billion. Now, I'm not too worried about this because in Hong Kong, we have no official debt at all. The debt to GDP ratio is near zero. All right. Whatever debt that the government had issued or raised was for the purpose of developing the debt market, like green finance, Islamic bonds, et cetera, which is not for the purpose of funding budget deficits. So we have a very healthy fiscal position. And the whole purpose of accumulating reserves over the years, which now amounts to 1.1 trillion Hong Kong dollars of fiscal reserves, is to use those reserves in order to support the economy in very unusual times as now. I don't think the use of fiscal reserves to run budget deficit at this point of time would lead to any doubt about our fiscal and monetary discipline. Okay? If our fiscal and monetary disciplines remain intact, then as these factors have been undermining the status of Hong Kong as an international financial center, if those disciplines remain intact, then Hong Kong's status as an international financial center would not actually be affected by this COVID-19 situation. Now, going on to the third shock, which is rather more complex, the deteriorating China-US relations. Now, you've heard quite a lot about this and about comments made by President Trump in relation to the national security legislation. I'm not a politician. I can't really go into the minds of high-level politicians such as President Trump and Secretary Pompeo. But hearing what he said, sometimes I get to be very upset and concerned. For example, President Trump said, the national security law will lead to one country, two systems becoming one country, one system. Now, I just scratch my head. How can that be? I mean, if he had just read the Joint Declaration or the Basic Law, he would realize even the preamble of the Basic Law points out that the two systems, meaning the socialist system in in the mainland of China will not be applied to Hong Kong. Hong Kong will maintain the capitalist system. So we still have socialist system on the mainland of China and capitalist system in Hong Kong. Now, how would national security law affect that? Now, we still have two monetary systems. We still have two financial systems. They continue to exist. But of course, he could well be talking about the erosion of freedom, which is a rather vague term. But even that, I also get concerned and upset. What freedom are we taking away? If you look carefully at the national security legislation, yes, we are taking away freedom. We are taking away freedom of sedition. We are taking away freedom to undermine national security. We are taking away freedom that for everybody, for anybody to be used as pawns against our own country. We are taking away freedom to incite riots and arson. I don't want that freedom. But as I said, I don't really understand politicians. And he said, Hong Kong will no longer be able to compete with free markets. Let the competition come. Let's play on equal terms. Huh? Sometimes perhaps I should stop here. In terms of the politics of it. What is comforting is that notwithstanding all these damaging comments, there has been capital inflow into Hong Kong, amounting to 120 billion Hong Kong dollars. That actually is very clear. Our financial system, our monetary system remain very robust, okay? But don't underestimate Trump and Pompeo in the US, obviously, because now they're actually talking about the weaponization of finance. This is something that is of concern to me. Now, finance, as I mentioned earlier, is the mobilization of money from investors to fundraisers, okay? And you need to use a currency for the purpose of clearing transactions. Of course, if you weaponize it, you can restrict the use of the currency. You can restrict investors from investing in the US, or restricting US investors from investing in China. And fundraising, you can restrict Chinese enterprises to raise funds in Hong Kong. Yes, certainly they've been talking about that. Delisting Chinese enterprises, listing in the New York Stock Exchange. And you can target individuals, you can target institutions, you can target fundraisers, you can target investors, you can target financial institutions, you can target the government even, if you really want to weaponize it. So all those combinations of targets and weapons can be used by the UN. It's a very strong and powerful arsenal at his disposal. Now, certainly, I really hope that he wouldn't do it. But unfortunately, the mechanism seems to already be in place. You know about the US President's executive order on Hong Kong normalization. That was actually made in the middle of this month. I would like you actually to read the first PowerPoint, that first bullet carefully. And this is direct quote from the executive order. China to impose national security legislation on Hong Kong constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to what? To the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. I mean, what is the logic of this? Okay, to the extent that the US president find it necessary to declare, he's declaring a national emergency with respect to that threat. Wow, very strong words. I'm afraid. It scared me. So there are quite a lot of this, although I don't quite know the logic behind this. He talked about the taking away preferential treatment, okay? But fortunately, I can assure you that on the financial front, there is no preferential treatment that he can take away. What can he take away? We have no preferential treatment at all on the financial front. Well, there you are. You have the executive order. And also, you have the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which enables the Secretary of State to pinpoint or to specify foreign persons, and at the same time, impose sanction on those foreign persons if they have done certain things, actions or policy that undermine democratic processes or institutions in Hong Kong. These are, foreign persons that he can name and impose sanctions. And the sanctions include, of course, freezing all their assets. Furthermore, if you are a financial institution that is dealing with these foreign persons, you can also be named. And if you are named, oh my God, the sanctions, there are 10 of them. Just read that bullet point. There are 10 of them. But the more important ones, obviously, is foreign exchange, banking transactions, etc. In other words, if you are a foreign financial institution providing financial services to a foreign person which has been identified as to have helped pass the national security law in Hong Kong, or to have undermined the democratic processes in Hong Kong, very general term, meaning very wide powers, then you can forget about doing business at all. All right? So these are very draconian measures, very, very draconian measures. Now, of course, what we're interested in is whether this weaponization of finance in Hong Kong finance in the US would hurt Hong Kong. As I said, there is a powerful arsenal at their disposal. So the implication on Hong Kong is how they use this arsenal, what sort of tools or weapons they use. And as I said, I don't know how President Trump thinks. I mean, in the end, what will he use? I just do not know. But I hope, and I think it is unlikely for the US to be using the nuclear option, which is to deny, for example, to deny Hong Kong as a whole in the use of the US dollar. Now, I'll tell you why later on, because I think there are significant downside risks for the US if they were to weaponize finance and make use of these sort of weapons. And I would draw your attention to what Stephen Roach said in an article that he wrote. He said, the era of the US dollar's exorbitant privilege as the world primary reserve currency is coming to an end. Now that is the crux of the matter. That is the risk that the US face if they abuse their exorbitant privilege. Now, I have a table here to show you what is called a net international investment position, okay? Obviously, if you invest more than you borrow from the rest of the world, then you have a net investment position, a positive position. But if you have borrowed more than you invest in the rest of the world, then you have a negative position. The United States is way at the bottom. It's a debtor country. It has borrowed money on a net basis amounting to 12 trillion US dollars. The next one is Spain, only 1 trillion. By far, the US dollar is the largest debtor in the world. If you look up at the table, the largest creditor is Japan. But if you add Hong Kong to China, Hong Kong obviously being part of China, we have a net creditor position of 3.6 trillion, 3.7 trillion, which is more than Japan. Now imagine the largest debtor of the world imposing restrictions on the use of its currency, be it the international currency of the world. imposing those restrictions on the largest creditor of the world. I mean, I find it difficult to comprehend as to why the US would be doing this. In brief, they would be asking for trouble, I think. If you look at this time series trend of the US net international investment position, that's really going down. As I mentioned, it's 12 trillion now in the first quarter of 2020. So that chart, the end of it, is falling further and further. And furthermore, if you look at what I call the macroeconomic scorecard of the United States. Now, I'm not an economics professor, I'm a part-time one anyway. But if you look at these numbers, just look at these numbers, the debt to GDP ratio, the unemployment rate, the budget deficit, the net national savings rate, and the central bank, the fact that the central bank is monetizing budget deficits, those are cardinal sins that you don't want to commit in running an economy. And they're doing all of that, almost all of that. Look at that scorecard. And if I was sitting on a desk at the IMF, monitoring the performance of these economies, and look at that scorecard, and block out the United States of America on top, I would say that the currency of that country would evaporate easily. But we're talking about the United States of America. Anyway, okay, to conclude, let us take a look briefly at the strategy for Hong Kong as an IFC going forward. We have to continue to focus on what we want to do. Okay, mobilization of money from those who have it to those in need between the mainland of China and the rest of the world. Focus on that. Continue to focus on that. Okay. Now, despite worsening China-US relations, the demand for financial intermediation will continue to grow because China is the second largest economy in the world. Its financial needs in terms of investment, in terms of fundraising, will grow. The rest of the world will have to deal with China, okay? If they are quarreling, perhaps it's even better for Hong Kong, but I don't really want them to be quarreling. If they're quarreling and don't deal directly with each other, they'll have to come to Hong Kong. Thank you very much, right? Second point, fintech. As I said, there'll be a new normal after the COVID-19, involving much less interaction between people, and therefore it may be a new normal that financial institutions will have to think very carefully about. I just often raise the question as to whether or not you need so many bank branches. If no one of us, except the old people, they still need to be served. I think we don't go to banks, do we? Well, very seldom anyway. The third point, the internationalization of the renminbi. Now, I just want to be very brief here. If I was sitting in Beijing and looking at the weaponization of finance by the United States, I would want to be less dependent on the US dollar, okay? And that obviously leads to the argument for further internationalizing the renminbi. Now, as an offshore financial center doing just that, we have to push along by introducing the renminbi into the capital markets in Hong Kong, making use of it, for example, in stock market trading. It is possible, okay? The last point is, of course, GBA finance. Let's focus on that. There is an international dimension as well because other people wanting to benefit from the economic development of the Greater Bay Area would need to come to Hong Kong, and that would help our status as an international financial center. I have used up my time, more than my use up my time. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Mr. Yam, for the truly thought-provoking sharing. For our friends of the media and audiences who would like to raise questions to Mr. Yam, please kindly submit your questions via the Zoom chat rooms or onto our social media platforms. Thank you very much. And now, let's proceed to our question and answer session. May I pass the time to our moderator, Mr. Stephen Wong, Deputy Executive Director and Head of the Public Policy Institute at our Hong Kong Foundation. Stephen, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, for your insightful thoughts. Let me follow up with a couple questions. I think we're already getting a lot of questions from the audiences as well as the media. So let me just start up with the first question from SCMP. I would paraphrase the question because I want to snip in my question as well. So the question is sort of related to the Hong Kong dollar pact, and I remember 8 years ago you wrote a paper also on this, whether the future of the pact would be from the U.S. dollar to a basket of currencies.
Thank you for embarrassing me.
and eventually to, but this is a question from SCMP, so or eventually to renminbi. What is your current view on that? Whether it's wise to link to a basket of currencies, or what is the timetable for eventually to renminbi?
I learned a lesson. As a retired public officer, you should still be very, very careful in what you speak and what you write. Although, it was 3 years.
Academic.
3 years, an academic paper. But I think if you read that carefully, all I said was that the government will have to ensure that the monetary policy, the objective of monetary policy, serves the public interest. Now, the public interest happens to be, as we discussed, Hong Kong as an international financial center. You want foreign investors and fundraisers to come to Hong Kong and make use of our currency and do international business. So tie your currency to the most important international currency. So that's why you link it to the US dollar. That is the most appropriate monetary policy objective. If that is the case, then by all means, continue with our linked exchange rate system and make it even more robust if possible. And it is a very robust and transparent system, a currency board system with US dollars backing a few times of our monetary base. That was an academic paper, as you said, but I was drawing attention to the need to ensure public policy addresses the public interest.
So do you think the current pact is is good for now?
Yes, good for a long time.
And the next question from SCMP as well is, its direct question is, well, what if U.S. restrict Hong Kong to access U.S. dollar? But I also wanted to delve deeper than that. You obviously mentioned the weaponization of finance by the U.S. And there's a list of things that the U.S. can do, but there clearly is a degree of seriousness when you said, well, it is a nuclear option. Are all of these nuclear options, or some of these are more sort of lesser serious, and therefore, in a way, even though you would probably say that you cannot guess what politicians do and to choose what weapon they use, but logically, do you think that there is a degree of seriousness, and therefore some of these weapons might be more likely to be used against Hong Kong?
Now, given that there is already this executive order of the president, given that there is the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and I have introduced some of the content of those two documents, I fear that at least, I think, in the next few months, the Secretary of State had to do it within 90 days, I think. They may actually name individuals, perhaps a few individuals. I'm talking about the country as a whole, not necessarily just Hong Kong.
Okay.
Name individuals and name as foreign persons as defined in the Act, and name foreign financial institutions. That would bring a lot of inconvenience to that individual and that financial institution. It's not really a nuclear option as such, but that act, that weapon actually brings a lot of questions amongst users of US dollars and users of the US financial system. Hey, how about our own position? Should we actually be managing the risk of being named? So they may target individuals, and they have targeted Chinese enterprises, companies. I don't think they would target government, because if they target government, then that's one of the nuclear options. Because if they target the Hong Kong SAR government and say that all your US dollar treasury holdings are frozen, then obviously that is a nuclear option.
Right.
That would mean that some of our functions cannot be performed.
But there would be a default on their part, isn't it? If they don't pay back the treasuries.
It's a two-edged sword.
Right.
And I hope that clever politicians like Trump and Pompeo will not go to that extent.
Right. I think there is a Chinese question, a Cantonese question, Chinese question. So I would ask it in Chinese. 任總可唔可以再講多少少用中文啦嚇？就美國如果取消喺香港嘅特別待遇，有冇喺金融方面有冇特別嘅待遇係你覺得可以取消？頭先你即係講到話 name person 咁樣，咁會唔會係亦都如果有個講法，亦都有其他傳媒都問啦嚇，即係好似都有啲政客開戶口都有啲難喎，而家會唔會係一個比較？特別喺外國嘅銀行嘅戶口會唔會即係持續都會繼續係咁樣咧？
嗰個就係另外一回事啦。如果你喺講金融領域上，美國政府有冇俾到香港成個經濟體系或者香港個金融體系有啲咩特殊待遇咧？好抱歉，我做咗好多年公職，就喺金融層面，我唔想像到，我唔記得係有啲咩特殊待遇，佢可以就咁就拎走嘅，係咪？咁但係如果你話係針對某某人或者針對某某機構而將佢嘅即係金融武器化，即係唔俾佢用美元，又或者唔俾佢喺嗰度。喺美國去投資或者集資，咁呢一個對嗰個人當然係有影響啦，但係對我哋系統、對我哋嘅機制係冇影響㗎。係嘛？
Yeah, I saw a lot of questions from media. Really, it's already sort of covered in your slides on the U.S. Potential deployment mechanism of the weaponization of finance, for example. All these things are covered. So I think. From what I read from a lot of media, they are interested to really understand the implications of what if, and would they do that, and what is the likelihood, and what if they do that, can we survive it? So what if they do that?
Well, I can only say that I hope they won't use these nuclear options because of the downside risks that are involved if they were to use that. As I said, I'm not a politician. I can't go behind their minds and see how they think.
Right. But do you think if they use some of these weapons, as you said, would Hong Kong continue to be able to serve as an international financial center?
If they don't use those nuclear options, that wouldn't affect Hong Kong's status as an international financial center. If they target individuals, individual financial institutions, that's a micro type of thing rather than a macro, weapon.
Can I ask you, for example, some people would say that in this new tension, or some people say there's a new Cold War, whatever, between China and U.S., and some people think that therefore, relatively, Singapore or even Tokyo would have a room for them to grow because now that people have to take sides, and if people want to take sides, Hong Kong obviously will therefore be lesser of a preference for people to do international business in Hong Kong. Would that be the case on a relative importance basis? even though Hong Kong can continue
Yeah,
to so.
I can see the argument,
Right.
but I am more convinced by the argument that the rest of the world will have to deal with the second largest economy of the world. There are financial deals or transactions that involve the mainland of China and the rest of the world. Those will grow and those will continue to take place, notwithstanding a worsening U.S.-China relationship. Unless, of course, the U.S. declares an outright war, a military war against China, in which case everything would be different. But if everybody maintains a sensible mind, politics notwithstanding, then those business of financial intermediation will continue. Because for China, there is a need for diversification of investment avenues and diversification of funding sources onto an international dimension. That's the same argument for investors and fundraisers in the rest of the world. That business will continue to grow. Now, where do you go to, if you want to sort of conduct or carry out that business? I think Hong Kong is still the preferred place because, after all, we are still the biggest and most efficient offshore renminbi market, for example, and the offshore center for fundraising of Chinese enterprises. If you are interested in investing in China concept stocks, where else do you go? Do you go to Tokyo? Do you go to Singapore? Well, I mean, but I come back to, another point that I make, which is the social unrest. And that, if it's allowed to continue, will lead to an outflow of financial talents, and that actually would not be good for Hong Kong.
Can I also follow up on the last two concepts you mentioned about the GBA, and obviously the Greater Bay Area? People talk about people flow, information flow, goods flow, and the most difficult part is probably the capital flow.
Yes.
And are there things that you think the PBOC can do so that there's some sort of regional relaxation to enhance that capital flow? Because some people said, well,
Stephen, you have put your fingers in the right place. Okay. Now, of course, to start with, the People's Bank of China are aware of what is needed for developing finance in the GBA area and for finance to be serving the GBA economy. They have actually published quite a long list of quite a number of points for development. But in my presentation, I drew your attention actually to a number of things on a strategic dimension. If you wish to develop GBA finance, I put it as the 5 C's, which is the last bullet point of the last slide. Capital mobility, which is the one that you refer to. Currency convertibility, another C. The third C, currency circulation within the GBA area. How about circulating the Hong Kong dollar as well in the GBA area? Channels for financial intermediation. How about allowing banks in the GBA area to take deposits within the GBA area and lend money within the GBA area without the geographical boundary? In other words, for Hong Kong banks to be taking deposits in GBA area and lending in GBA area. The 5th C is connectivity of the financial infrastructure. Now, when you asked your question, you talked about capital mobility. It is the crux of the matter. If you allow capital mobility within the GBA area, then capital would be mobilized more efficiently and used more efficiently within the GBA area. That would benefit the economy. I have no doubt about it. The the concern on the part of the mainland of China is, of course, that mobility within the GBA area, if allowed, may have holes, that may affect the rest of the mainland of China. And they may therefore have to ring fence that mobility within the GBA area. And now that is a strategy that they can adopt. Okay? Now, I am in favor of capital mobility, much greater capital mobility within the GBA area. In other words, for investment funds to move in and out more freely. Of course, you need to circumscribe it in such a way as to manage the financial risks arising therefrom. Because if it is totally free, then you could have speculators playing around with your currency or your financial system. Now, there are ways of doing this. You can have all sorts of mechanisms to manage those risks to financial stability.
Is it a bit like, almost building a second capital border within the GBA so that, the money flows from the rest of the mainland to GBA, so that you don't create a big hole in the capital border?
Well, that's the concept.
Right.
All right. To put it simply, within the GBA area, it would be desirable, a lot more desirable, for the GBA economy to develop if there is capital mobility within GBA. Yep. Now, the risk, of course, is that mobility may spread to other provinces on the mainland of China, and that may actually undermine financial stability if the risks are not properly managed. So the important thing is to manage those risks. Yep. You can register institutions within GBA so that they qualify to doing that. Yeah. You can have limits as to the amount of capital that you can move around. There are many ways of doing it, but that is the overall important concept that you have to embrace.
Going back on your point, the financial institutions be able to take deposit and lend within GBA. Almost that is being done before within the Zimao Kui. Previously, in Shanghai, they have arrangements so that the bank seems to keep a separate account book so that they can manage the capital within that region without having that leakage per se. Is this something that can be explored on that as well? So a separate account to monitor the fund flow by the banks within GBA.
Well, as I said. If you develop GBA finance, there are certain risks that you have to manage. If you are satisfied that those risks are being managed prudently, then it's okay. Leave it to the market to determine what is good for the economy. Now, I'm only promoting, these channels of financial intermediation by allowing banks in Hong Kong to take deposits or lend within GBA without additional bureaucracy, and allow banks on the mainland or in GBA to perhaps even take deposits in Hong Kong and lend in Hong Kong. Now, they themselves, with the profit motive working, can determine where the money should go and where the money should come from. I would leave it to the market, but it's opening up that channel that is important.
呢下一個問題就係有線電視，我又要抒發 channel， 因為呢個係中文問題，我哋應承咗用中文問嘅。咁就任總今日就冇提到，但係之前個 interview 我記得你都有提過，就係嗰個所謂第三波嘅金融危機即係07、08第一波97、98第一波，第二波就係08。咁你就話有機會呢即係 given 而家呢個 circumstances 有一個第三波嘅金融危機。咁香港係咪有防禦能力嘅咧？
我覺得係，因為無論你係睇貨幣制度或者金融制度，甚至乎你係具體一啲睇嗰個銀行體系、證券行業。各行各業喺金融界裏邊嘅各行各業嚟睇咧，都係好穩健嘅。嗱，尤其是個銀行體系， 我哋嘅資本充足率係差唔多全世界最高嘅。我哋嘅流動資金比率亦都係非常之高嘅。我哋個槓桿比率係低嘅。咁呢一個而且呢啲銀行咧一路向以來咧受金管局嘅監管咧都係即係好有效率嘅監管，同埋係好審慎嘅監管嘅，以一個風險為本嘅理念去監管呢啲嘢嘅。咁樣我哋好多風浪都見過啦，但係呢一次嘅風浪咧就可能唔係因為即係97、98。即係金融全球化影響到個別嘅亞洲經濟體系、金融體系而發生，又唔係好似07、08年個次按危機，因為個金融嘅文化，華爾街嘅金融文化出現好大嘅問題而發生。但係呢兩個問題我曾經講過啦，呢兩個咁嘅問題都未解決嘅。而家又有新一輪嘅量寬，又即係各個地方都係有一個好大嘅財政嘅赤字同時咧，因為咁多銀紙走嚟走去嘅陣時候咧，啲資產價格又上升，係同嗰個經濟係脫節嘅。咁如果有啲咩嘢嘅觸發點係令到有一個好大嘅調整嘅時候咧，係有可能影響到呢啲貨幣金融體系嘅。但係我唔覺得香港係會即係，我當然會受影響，但係唔係系統性嘅影響咯。
So if you can elaborate a bit more about what you just said on the potential or inevitable the third wave of financial crisis when you talked about.
I wouldn't say that it is inevitable,
Right.
but if you just look at the macroeconomic numbers of certain countries and look at the how the international financial system is behaving, you cannot but be worried. Actually, asset prices are very elevated. The economies of the Western countries are not doing particularly well. Budget deficits as a percentage of GDP is huge. Debt to GDP ratio is very high. Unemployment rate is very high. Okay, inflation is not a problem. So you may not need to have high interest rates, so that may not be a trigger. But something in the end will need to give.
Right.
And that may well be the trigger for a sharp adjustment in asset prices, leading to the viability of financial institutions being put in doubt, and therefore a financial crisis.
But in the scenario that you just painted, isn't that a potential for a pretty big, amount of drops in the asset prices potentially? May not be the base case scenario. Let's say when you do risk management, you risk manage to probably the worst case scenario. But what can be the worst case scenario? Like housing prices drop by X percentage, or stock market drop by X percentage?
I wouldn't want to predict that. But to answer your question, whether or not there is to put your question in another way, it's whether or not there is likely to be a sharp drop in asset prices. The simple answer is yes. Yes. I mean, it's all there, written on the numbers. But it has not happened yet because the Fed keep on pumping money. Our President Trump is still talking up the market because of the election, etc., etc. But the reality will come.
Right. But would that be, you also mentioned that you worry more about the US dollar drop by a pretty big percentage. You cited, obviously, Professor Roach on his prediction of 35% drop of the US dollar. Coupled with the drop in US dollar and the potential scenario of the asset price drop, what should Hong Kong people be prepared for?
Well, I don't. Yeah, Stephen Roach may well be right. He predicted a 35% fall on a trade-weighted basis of the US dollar. Now, mind you, that has happened before, and it happened within the period when the Hong Kong dollar was still linked to the US dollar firmly. So if this happened again, and for as long as the US dollar continued to be the international currency or the preferred medium of transaction for international business, then we continue to be linked to the US dollar. That shouldn't present to us any serious problem. But if you're not talking about a 35% drop in the US dollar, you're talking about an even bigger adjustment, then it would be problematic, because there may come a point where you would ask the question as to whether or not, we're linked to a big ship, all right? And if the ship is sinking, big ship is sinking, do you really still want to be tied to it? But we're not. Now, I have to repeat again and again, we are not talking about that sort of a scenario.
Okay.
I don't think that sort of a scenario will happen, no. But a substantial drop in the US dollar on a trade-weighted basis against other currencies, yes. A substantial downward adjustment in asset prices worldwide, yes.
And we talked about sort of the U.S. dollar, and people, as you probably just, if I can understand correctly, that you also probably agree with Stephen Roach that the dominance of the U.S. dollar as an international currency will probably be subside a little bit, and
it will take time. It
will take time. And can you also therefore talk about renminbi internationalization? Are you happy with sort of the pace of it? We've been talking about that for 10 years now. And what can be done to continue to expedite the renminbi internationalization?
There is a problem with the international monetary system, with the dominance of the US dollar, and the US dollar being not backed by robust macroeconomic performance, okay? So it is an unstable international monetary system. Now, there is also the euro, but Europe's economy is not, it's relatively speaking, more or less, encountering the same sort of problem as the US. So you need perhaps a third leg in the international monetary system to stabilize it, okay? And which one is the candidate for as the third leg? I mean, there's only the renminbi, but the Japanese yen can play a role, right? So, but the renminbi is not fully internationalized because there are still capital controls on the mainland of China. But there is a need for the renminbi to be further internationalized. There is no doubt about it. And I have mentioned specifically taking the renminbi internationalization program onto the capital markets offshore. In other words, making greater use of the renminbi in capital markets offshore, in Hong Kong, for example. Already it's being used because debt issues in renminbi have already been arranged, but you can use it in the stock market as well. All right? Stock market, secondary market trading in Hong Kong could well be denominated in the renminbi alongside that of the Hong Kong dollar, and giving people a choice as to which particular currency you use. If I were, I've said this before, if I were an international investor wanting to invest in China concept stocks, I may actually want to expose or incur currency exposure in the renminbi rather than in the Hong Kong dollar. That's quite natural. Why not give people this choice? Now, if it's possible to internationalize the renminbi and take on a new dimension in the capital markets, that I think would be a good move.
And you mentioned about fintech, and I also asked you about this pretty hot topic these days about digital currency, the DCEP, sort of pioneered by the PBOC, along with a lot of other central banks in the world. A lot of them are talking about a sovereign digital currency. You have any views on that?
My view is that in this day and age with modern technology, look at everybody. Everybody is holding a phone and would like actually to use that device for the purpose of payment in digital form rather than in physical form. So the organization responsible for the issue of money is, of course, the central bank. And even in Hong Kong, the monetary authority is responsible, but through the three note issuing banks. Now, there is a need for money to be digitalized so that users can make use of it conveniently. You don't have to carry cash, to buy things. You can take out your phone and there you are. A transaction is completed real time, okay? So that actually makes the use of money or the mobilization of money within the economy much more efficient. That is the concept. That is the purpose, all right? You don't digitalize something because it is the fashion to do so.
Right.
You do it for a purpose. The purpose is to enhance the efficiency of the mobilization of money in the economy, right?
Yep.
If the new generation, they all want money in digital form and not in physical form.
Right.
So let's provide it. Now, it's not that difficult actually to do that because the users are actually quite familiar with the use of digital money or use of their own device for doing that. Different central banks are actually embarking on that route. I hope here in Hong Kong we can also consider that in due course.
And some people talks about, you mentioned that the U.S., obviously the current cross-border payment system or really the international financial market is sort of dominated by a lot of existing rules and mechanisms. And how likely is to build an alternative to the SWIFT system that people talks about, that in order to avoid potential sanctions or influences by the U.S., people talks about the alternatives of cross-border payment system.
Yeah.
Is this realistic or is it
Well, unfortunately, it is unrealistic to be reforming this sort of payment arrangements on an international dimension. SWIFT has been in use for a long, long time. By the way, it is a Belgian company, a cooperative company.
Right.
And it is not a company that is controlled by the U.S. or the U.S. government. It is a cooperative company controlled by users. Of course, the U.S. may be the largest user of that system, and so they may have a certain influence. But I doubt if they can influence it to such an extent as to forbid China to make use of it or Hong Kong to make use of it. So, but it is a commercially run system that is not exactly 100% robust and perfect. I think the most robust mechanism for international payments is for central banks to be linked to each other through their own payment systems. Okay, in that way, you achieve central bank money payment, which is very robust and very efficient. Unfortunately, central banks are still operating on a mentality that is not adequately modern, unfortunately. It takes time for them to get used to that, right? If you may be aware that in Hong Kong, we have a real-time gross settlement system for 4 currencies. 4 currencies. In fact, the Hong Kong dollar, the US dollar, the euro, and the renminbi. They're all linked to each other. And if you are doing a deal, let's say Hong Kong dollar against US dollar, a foreign exchange deal, you can get real-time gross settlement, payment versus payment, real-time, immediately. Okay, that is a very robust system. That's the sort of system that should actually be in place rather than a commercially run a system.
You mentioned the current settlement system in Hong Kong for renminbi, and I heard that we are, clearing a huge amount of renminbi as well as US dollar in Hong Kong, and therefore people usually say that Hong Kong as a financial center, not just for securities, equities, but also for a lot of this payment clearing. Do you think this is something particularly for the U.S. dollar clearing or settlement hub? Would that be affected in this China-U.S. tension?
Well, depending on what sort of moves they
Right.
make. Okay, we have a U.S. dollar clearing system in Hong Kong, but ultimately, the clearing bank for U.S. dollar, which is the Hong Kong Bank,
Yep.
will have to clear with the Federal Reserve Bank. So the ultimate clearing is still in New York. Okay, although we have some sort of a satellite system for clearing money in Hong Kong. As I said, the U.S. dollar is a very strong and powerful weapon.
You mentioned about inflation, right? All the central bankers are worried about inflation, and we are seeing none these days, which really defile the monetary theory of if you print more money, you eventually will see inflation. Do you think we eventually will see inflation somewhere in the world?
I'm not sure, but we may. The reason why inflation is not high, notwithstanding so much money being printed and sloshing around, is because there is a very quick or huge advancement of information technology enhancing productivity. Now, with productivity being enhanced, you don't need to increase prices, right? It's as simple as that. Now, that enhancement of productivity through the use of information technology, I don't know whether or not there is a limit. If the limit is reached, then there'll be diminishing returns, and therefore prices will start to increase if there is too much money in the economy. I don't know. I'm not an expert on information technology, but it's possible.
And can we also spend the last part of our discussion on the real economy of Hong Kong? Now that we are seeing the jobs, unemployment rate going up, and potentially, we may see this third financial crisis or not, or the COVID third wave or COVID fourth wave or whatever. And now there's some people are saying that, well, they need to have another relief package, or more and more relief package from the government. Yes, we are fiscally sound, but can we afford to do that, do more of relief measures in the future, and how big and when?
I wouldn't want to be precise as to how much and when, but I would draw your attention, obviously, to the debt-to-GDP ratio in Hong Kong, which is 0, compared with 125% in the US, for example. We have accumulated 1.1 trillion Hong Kong dollars of fiscal reserves, and we are now talking about the use of 300 billion in the financial year 2020-21. Or running a budget deficit of about 10% of GDP. Now, that is large, but the circumstances justified the use of our fiscal reserves in that way. Whether or not 300 billion or 10% of GDP is large enough, let us see. But I fear that may not be large enough. There may need to be further support measures, making use of further money, but I have no doubt about it. We can afford it because we have no debt whatsoever, and we have a very robust monetary and financial system in Hong Kong. As to how that money, now you can determine at the macro level how much money you pump into the economy in support of the economy. As to how that money is to be distributed is obviously a political process. Okay, but in that political process, as I have pointed out to other people, there is a need to consider what the new normal is like in the economy after COVID-19. There is likely to be much less person-to-person contact. So if you are spending money to support an economy, support the one that can survive in the new normal. And the one that cannot survive, I'm not saying that of leaving them alone and not paying any attention to them. Your target may well be the people employed in it, people who are made redundant. So it's a political process, but I'm sure the government would be able to to find the right balance.
But can you sort of comment on the uncertainties of the economy for Hong Kong in the next year or 2 years, given a lot of factors?
I think it
going on?
very much depends on where, when, and how available is the vaccine that we are longing for. I mean, if there is a vaccine quickly developed and it's widely available to the people of Hong Kong, then things can quickly return to normal. I'm not a medical expert, so I do not know when that will come about.
Thanks, Joseph. It's been very insightful, and thanks so much for your comments.
Thank you.
Give it back to Serena.
And this concludes today's live webinar. Once again, thank you, Mr. Yam, for your insightful sharing. Our next Insight Forum speaker is Professor C.F. Lee, who is currently the president of the Zhuhai College of Higher Education and a fellow of the Chinese Academy of Engineering. He will be speaking to us on 18th of August on the topic, 知水,知學,知心. Please stay tuned for more information on our Hong Kong Foundation's main Facebook page and the Public Policy Institute's 政策 Facebook page. It's been a pleasure speaking in front of you today. Thank you all for joining. Stay healthy and have a great day.